Alireza Firouzja just had a very tough tournament at the Superbets Chess Classic with 1 victory, 2 losses, and 6 draws. He was the #1 seed, and he did not perform as he had hoped. This game is from better times. This is the Norway Chess Tournament at Stavanger in September of 2021, classical time control. His opponent is Richard Rapport, and in this game we see a clearer example of the kind of chess we hope to see from Firouzja in the Candidates Tournament. Let's jump right in. Firouzja has white, Rapport has black. Firouzja plays e4, Rapport responds with a Sicilian. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. The Rossolimo Sicilian threatens to capture on c6 and do some damage to black's pawn structure. Rapport ignores it, just plays knight to f6 and counterattacks the e-pawn instead. Knight to c3 defending. Now knight to d4. He could have just defended the knight with the queen at c7 if he had chosen to, just to protect the pawn structure, but instead he jumps into d4. e5, the main move, hitting the knight on f6 and already forcing an early crisis. Knight takes bishop, knight takes b5, knight takes d5. So this is the direction black has chosen to go in, but white does score really well here. After castling, which Firouzja plays, we see that white has 2 minor pieces developed and he's castled, whereas black only has 1 minor piece and is developed and is a long way from castling. a6, and Firouzja does not move the knight. He counterattacks with c4. The knight goes to b4, and then knight to c3. Rapport attacks the center with d6, wants to take away Firouzja's space advantage. If he had just jumped in with d3, then after queen e2, knight takes bishop, rook takes knight, white just has a huge lead in development. So after d6, Firouzja plays d4. The main line here is e d6, and it's a safer option. Firouzja plays d4, and this is actually an exchange sacrifice idea. He really wants to take advantage of that big lead in development. Pawn takes, and then queen takes d4. And this is a novelty in this position. Knight to c2, and that, of course, is the fork that Firouzja is allowing to take place. Queen to e4, knight a1, and bishop to f4. And just look at this position. Look at all of these pieces are developed. He's castled, and computers actually consider this an equal position, even though black at the moment is up a rook. Bishop to e6, rook takes a1. Now he's only up in exchange. Rook to c8, attacking the c4 pawn. Firouzja plays the knight to d5 to block that attack. Pawn takes, knight to e5. And this is really cool. You don't see this kind of arrangement of knights very often at d5 and e5. If I were this black king, I would be very nervous. Very nervous right now. f6 to kick the knight away. Knight f3. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes. And by taking that knight, now black does not have the 2 bishops. And look at all these weak light squares around black's king. Pretty intimidating. Rook to c5. Rapport attacks the d5 pawn. And Firouzja plays d6. The pawn cannot be taken because the e-pawn is pinned, and if the queen takes, the bishop would just recapture. And he's threatening a fork, knight d4, knight e6, which would hit the queen and the rook. Black plays queen to d7. He wants to exchange queens off at c6. But let's look at a couple of lines, some really cool lines, really. If he plays e5 here, which seems to make sense, white would like to sacrifice on e5, but this rook at c5 would defend that pawn. So the idea is you would play b4, rook b5, a4, rook to b6. So now the rook is not defending the pawn, and then white could have crashed through. Knight takes, queen e5, check, and here there are all sorts of lines. If bishop to e7, obviously, you just pile on the pinned bishop. If king to f7, queen to d5, check. If king to g6, after g4, there are all sorts of threats along this rank. And king 8, rook e1, king d7, queen e6, king c6, rook to c1, mate is another possible line if he if Rapport had taken that risky decision. But instead, he plays queen to d7 to trade off. b4 to kick the rook back. Rook to e1, piling on. King to f7. And this was a mistake. The best idea here might have been to just play king to d8 and try to flee the king to the queen side. Another possibility actually was pawn takes, and if bishop takes, Now you can play king to d8 also, and black is surviving. But this is risky stuff. You really would not like to be in a position like this. Rapport played king to f7. Now knight to d4, hits the rook, and he responds with e5. And this turns out to be the decisive mistake. The best approach, it turns out, was e d6. And after queen to d5, check, king g6, white still has a better position, but black is still surviving in this position. But after Rapport's e5, he's in trouble. And Firouzja is going to be able to take advantage of this. First, he plays queen to d5, check. King to g6 was the response. If instead he plays king to e8, then bishop takes, pawn, queen e5, check, king d8, knight c6, check, queen c6, and a4, and he's really bringing the heat. After a move like bishop to d6, check, queen to g5, check, and there's just no good decision that black can make. If, for example, he plays king to c8, then rook to c1, defended by the queen, and it pins black's queen to the king. If he plays king to d7, then queen to g7, check. Checks the king and attacks the rook at h8. There are really no good choices here for him to make. So he plays king to g6 instead, but the destructive sacrifice is still played. If he takes the bishop, which he did not do, then knight f3, threatening a fork at e5 of the king and the queen. Queen d6, knight to e5, check. And if king to h6, of course, knight to f7 forks. If king to f6, queen to f7, check, king to g5, f4, king to h4, g3, king h3, and queen to f5 is checkmate. Wow, what would have been amazing if that had appeared on the board. So instead, Rapport, to avoid that, plays rook to d6, giving back some material. Bishop takes d6, bishop d6. And now material is equal. The material Firouzja has sacrificed has now been recovered, but the attack continues. Queen to e4, check, king to f7, queen to d5, king to g6. So now what he wants to do, he wants to play knight f3, h4, check, to force the king over into h6. The problem is he can't do that right now. If Firouzja plays knight f3 here, then Rapport would play bishop h2 check, winning the queen. After knight takes, just queen takes queen. So what Firouzja does is he sets that up by playing g3. Now there is no bishop h2 check, and he is threatening to play this idea with the knight. h6 to give the king a place to hide. Rook to d1, Firouzja sets up all these threats along the d-file. Rook to e8, knight to f3, rook to e6 to defend the d6 bishop, which was being attacked by the queen. Knight to h4 check, king to h7. And there's one more little trick. Firouzja cannot pile on to this bishop by playing knight to f5 because Rapport would respond with rook to e5 with a double attack on the queen and the knight, and the position would be equalized in that case. So first, Firouzja plays queen to d3 check, getting his queen off of that sensitive square, and Rapport actually resigned here. And the reason is once he moves the king, now knight to f5 does work. The knight, the queen, and the rook all pile on the pinned bishop. He wins that final piece, and the game is over. A very well-played game in classical time control by Alireza, and this is the kind of chess we hope to see at the candidates tournament. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.